What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, giving you my players to cut for Week 3. But before we get started, make sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros. And if you want a chance to win a signed Deebo Samuel San Francisco 49ers jersey courtesy of bettingpros.com, your place to start betting smarter and not harder, you need to subscribe to the FantasyPros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to claim your prize. Now let's go ahead and dive right in. We'll start off with players to cut in deep leagues of 12 teams or more. First up, Rashad Penny. In Week 1, Kenneth Gainwell dominated the Eagles' backfield with a 62% snap share, 14 carries, and 4 receptions. DeAndre Swift played 29% of snaps with just 1 carry and 1 reception. Rashad Penny was a healthy scratch. But before we could even think about cutting him, Kenneth Gainwell suffered a rib injury and was ruled out for Week 2, so we had to keep Penny rostered just to see what type of workload he'd have with Kenneth Gainwell out. And we officially have our answer. Penny has no role in the Eagles offense, and we have zero reason to roster him. DeAndre Swift had a whopping 28 carries for 175 yards. Even Boston Scott had more involvement than Penny before being pulled from the game due to a concussion. Penny had 3 carries for 9 yards and 1 reception for 5 yards. I just don't see any scenario where Penny becomes relevant. He doesn't have value as a handcuff. Now, sure, there's the scenario where maybe Kenneth Gainwell can't return from his injury and Boston Scott is out and then he's the direct handcuff. But that is not a scenario where you can actually use him. At least we know now, and we're not holding on to Penny for the rest of the season. You can cut him. Next up, Michael Gallop. You might be looking at me and saying, who rosters Michael Gallop? Personally, I don't, but apparently 53% of you in ESPN leagues do, and I must implore you, please cut this man. Gallop has been outproduced by literally everyone else in the Cowboys receiving corps. In Week 1, he had 1 reception on 2 targets for 10 yards. In Week 2, without Brandon Cooks, Gallop had 1 reception on 2 targets for 3 yards. He was outproduced by Jalen Tolbert. Yes, the same Jalen Tolbert that straight up lost his job last year due to poor performance. Gallop could come out in a matchup against a poor Arizona team and have a better performance, but I can't imagine having the confidence to put him in a starting lineup. This offense is Tony Pollard and CeeDee Lamb. That is it. Brandon Cooks is roster-worthy purely based off of his track record. Even Jake Ferguson is easily outproducing Gallop. This one is easy. Cut Michael Gallop. Next up, Allen Lazard. Allen Lazard was on the cut list last week, and he is still rostered in nearly 40% of ESPN leagues, so I'm throwing him back into the fold to reiterate this week. I'm not sure if you're waiting on the Jets to bring in another quarterback and therefore holding on to Allen Lazard makes sense if that happens, but Tom Brady is not happening. Actual free agent quarterbacks you can bring in are wildly unappealing. Are you really rolling out Allen Lazard if Carson Wentz shows up? No. There is the reality that there is no ideal quarterback situation here for the foreseeable future. Yes, they could make a trade. That's not happening this week, and probably not next week. There is no reason to hold on to Allen Lazard. It is possible that Wilson could improve and grow over the course of the season, but Garrett Wilson is really the only true beneficiary that you could actually trust to play on a weekly basis. So much like last week, we need to cut Allen Lazard. Next up, Juju Smith-Schuster. Putting Juju Smith-Schuster as a repeat on the cut list was a very easy choice. And I moved him up to the deep list. He was on the list in shallow leagues last week after a very underwhelming 4-reception game on just 54% of snaps. And all he could manage this week was 5 receptions with 59% of snaps. He is so painfully clearly not the wide receiver 1 of this team. Devontae Parker and Kendrick Bourne out-targeted him this week. He hangs on just barely in very, very deep leagues, purely based off the fact that he gets a decent baseline of targets that makes him worth it to just hold on as someone that you can at least put in for some level of fantasy points. But he offers zero upside. I cannot fathom a scenario where I look at my bench and say, yes, we are rolling out Juju this week and I feel good about it. 7 fantasy points is not going to make an impact in your lineup. And this is likely the best case scenario. Mac Jones actually had high attempts in both games to open up the season due to the matchups against Philadelphia and Miami. Moving forward, he's got matchups against the Jets, Dallas, New Orleans. Those are not really scenarios where he's going to be pushing that 40 to 50 target range. So if those targets do come down, Juju is probably looking at minuscule production. I just can't get there with Juju. Moving on to players to cut in shallow leagues. First up, Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashad Bateman. Okay, so I'm going to cheat on this one. This is a 2 players in 1 drop recommendation. Between Odell Beckham Jr. and Rashad Bateman, one of these players should not be rostered. It's probably Bateman. Bateman's snap count did increase this week, likely due to Odell's injury, but he still only saw 3 targets and produced 18 yards off of them. This offense is different under Todd Monken, but Lamar Jackson has never supported a secondary receiving option on a consistent basis. Mark Andrews is the alpha, Zay Flowers is the wide receiver 1, everyone else is just looking for scraps, and Odell has been getting the majority of those scraps. Odell played on 92% of snaps in week 1, and in week 2 he had the injury and played on just 52% of snaps, but had 3 receptions on 4 targets with that snap count. So again, Odell has looked like the wide receiver 2. But again, that wide receiver 2 role has never been particularly useful or reliable. It could be if it's the right person, but there's a lot of factors going on here that make it hard to really rely on Odell or Bateman. And the big problem with committing to one versus the other is that Odell is dealing with an injury. And while the injury doesn't seem serious, it is poor practice to drop a wide receiver 3 when the wide receiver 2 could be out. For all we know, Bateman gets a higher snap count and is in a good matchup and thrives and earns a bigger role. And non-serious injuries have been known to linger with older players. So here's what you gotta do. This is why it's a 2-in-1. Easy solution number 1. If Odell is out and your league doesn't allow him to go in an IR spot, just go ahead and drop him. Simple solution. And that makes Bateman the player that fantasy managers should be keeping. But if Odell is on track and practices and plays, you can drop Bateman right before kickoff and get a high upside handcuff. Next up, Jamal Williams. If your league does not allow players who are out to sit in IR spots, you gotta take a look at cutting Jamal Williams. I love Jamal. You hate to cut him. But the reality is that he could miss multiple weeks, and at the very least this week. And Alvin Kamara returns next week. Kendre Miller has been deemed healthy and will get his opportunity to show off his capabilities this week. Williams could come back to very little involvement. But a hamstring injury on a 28-year-old running back doesn't really bode well for a quick return, and the Saints have no real incentive to rush him back. If and when this backfield does get all their backs healthy, there's very few scenarios where you would feel comfortable starting Williams. Alvin Kamara, Kendre Miller, even Taysom Hill's obligatory carries plus Jamal Williams, it just definitely doesn't really seem worth waiting for. We'd hoped during the offseason that we'd get some kind of repeat of the old days with Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara and that Jamal Williams could fill that role. But you have to remember, Kendre Miller was one of the most popular pre-draft running backs with NFL teams. The GMs loved him. Team after team were pulling him in for visits and workouts. He's a very well-rounded 3-down back, and if he gets the chance, he could cement his role as the backup while Jamal Williams is out. Again, if you can hold on to him in an IR spot, do it. There's no reason not to. But if you can't, maybe just cut your losses. Next up, Chigoziem Okonkwo. I hate to do this one, and I will only do it in shallow leagues, but we have to consider dropping Chig Okonkwo. It's not him. It's not Chig's fault. Chig is talented, he is real, and his future could be bright under different circumstances, but these circumstances right here, this is what nightmares are made of. In week 1, Chig saw 2 targets with 0 receptions. In week 2, excellent matchup against the Chargers defense that really enjoys giving up big performances. And Chig's big performance was 4 receptions on 4 targets for 35 yards. And honestly, last week might have been the most ideal circumstances that he could have faced, and that was the result. I mean, the Titans won the game. Ryan Tannehill had a good performance, completing 20 of 24 passes for 246 yards and a touchdown. And while it might not seem like much for Ryan Tannehill, that was strong. Hopkins led the team in targets. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine had the most fantasy points out of all the pass catchers, and Treylon Burks had the most yardage out of the pass catchers. I thought Chig was a fine target for those who prefer to wait for tight end in drafts, but at this point, you're better off streaming based off matchups. And 3 of the next 4 games are not really that tight end friendly for the Titans. Sadly, you can cut Chig. And the final player on our cut list is Kadarius Toney. I debated last week around who we were cutting from the Chiefs, and I hate to admit it, I chose the wrong one, but I will admit it, I did. Ultimately, I do think that Toney does have the higher upside, and that's why I chose Sky Moore as the one to cut. And the Chiefs clearly want to push Toney and will him to success. But the problem is, I just don't think that's going to happen. Toney played just 28% of snaps last week and had 5 receptions on 5 targets. Clearly, they want to involve him. But at the end of the day, this man just can't stay healthy. You can have all the upside in the world, but when you're barely available, the upside is just kind of pointless. Toney is dealing with a sprained toe and has yet to practice this week as of the filming of this video. And by the time you're watching this video, he might already be declared out. If he's out, you can stash him on an IR spot if you have the ability to do so. But Toney's availability is just a nightmare roller coaster at this point. He is not worth the trouble. You can cut him. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to Fantasy Pros across all platforms. And remember, if you want a chance to win a signed Deebo Samuel San Francisco 49ers jersey courtesy of bettingpros.com, your place to start betting smarter and not harder, you need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video and that's it. We'll be announcing the winner right here on the channel, so make sure you turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to claim your prize.